The cultural shifts that have happened in our society have changed many, many venues. Christianity being one of the more influential aspects of our society. It used to be Christianity was really the central characteristic that we would see, and Christians understood their place in our broader culture. But that's changed. We now live in a post-Christian culture. And what's more interesting than that, though, what's more concerning, I guess I should say, is that the culture is now influencing our Christianity more than our Christianity is influencing our culture. How is it that we can be held captive by the things that we see rather than being the salt and light that Jesus commands us to be? We're going to be talking about that on this Come Let Us Reason Together. Hi everyone, I'm Lenny Esposito, and on this Come Let Us Reason Together, I'm excited to discuss what has been called a new challenge in the Christian faith. And I have someone with me who's written specifically on this topic of Christianity being shaped and molded by the broader cultural poles that we see today. Welcome with me, John G. West, whose new book out, Stockholm System Christianity, really addresses this idea of Christians who are more being influenced and are adopting positions that we would consider not merely non-Christian, but almost antithetical to the Christian faith. Now, John West is an author, filmmaker, and scholar. He's written or edited 13 books, including Darwin Day in America, The Politics of Revelation and Reason, The Magician's Twin, and the C.S. Lewis Reader's Encyclopedia. He has worked on projects like Darwinian racism and eugenics in America, and he is also vice president for the Center of Science and Culture at the Discovery Institute. And of course, he had worked for many, many years at Seattle Pacific University, where he chaired the Department of Political Science and Geography. So John, welcome to the show. Glad to meet you almost virtually now as we go.
Yes, thank you, Lenny, for having me.
So I find this interesting. First of all, a little bit of your background, because you not only came out of Seattle Pacific, which is an important Christian university, but your background was in kind of politics, yet you're at the Discovery Institute, which is a science center. So tell me how that came about.
Sure. Well, so Discovery Institute, actually, most people know about it because of Steve Meyer or Michael Behe or Casey Luskin on the intelligent design area, but it actually began as a public policy think tank back in 1991. And so we didn't begin getting involved in intelligent design until 1996, when I co-founded the Center for Science and Culture sort of project with Steve Meyer. So Discovery, even today, still does things on economic policy, on bioethics, on technology policy, and a lot of different issues. But by far, it's most known for, and its biggest thing does relate to intelligent design. So how did I get involved in that? Well, I've always been interested in the impact of scientific materialism on culture, including politics, but our theories of morality, theories of personal responsibility, crime and punishment, sexuality. And so when I met with Steve Meyer, actually invited him out in the summer of, maybe it was 1994, to give a talk to a summer program I was running called the George Washington Fellows Program for Discovery. He gave the talk that later really became the basis of his book, Signature in the Cell. And that was really a life-changing talk for me, because from the standpoint of the social sciences, I was used to the social sciences were basically redrafted the 19th century based off of 19th century natural science, that were all basically matter and motion. And then the study of politics, which used to be an art, became a science that sort of reduced people to, they're blind matter and motion too. But what Steve Meyer was saying was that if you go down to the very heart of matter, DNA and beyond, you're finding indications of mind there, the information that came from a mind. And so that sort of subverted the 19th century reductionism, if you will, of the 19th century natural scientists, and saying that on the basis of science itself, we could show that that wasn't true. And then I got thinking, well, if that's true, then a lot of the 19th century social sciences and early 20th century social sciences that were built on this reductionist, materialist natural science, well, they had to be rethought too. And so between that thought and Steve Meyer's thought that there needed to be a place that could help cultivate some of these arguments, we sort of came up with the idea of establishing a program, the Center for Science and Culture. Actually, earlier it was Renewal of Science and Culture, but it was kind of a handful to say, so a mouthful to say. So we simplified it. So anyway, I was always involved sort of through readings of people like C.S. Lewis and G.K. Chesterton about the pernicious impacts of materialism on culture, including politics. But when I became connected with Steve Meyer, I had this new window into reality that the sciences themselves were actually pointing back, I'd say, in an older, more holistic direction. And so that's sort of how we came up with the idea for the Center for Science and Culture.
Well, that's a great explanation and understanding of it. I appreciate that. One of the things that I think is also interesting in this is that you tend to find that people, when they find a theory that seems to work in one area, they really try to apply it across many different and disparate disciplines. So you start to get a Darwinian theory or evolutionary theory in economics, and you start to get evolutionary theory in social engagement, and all of these other kinds of things where it becomes far astray from the original intent of trying to understand diversity in biology. And then, secondly, what happens is when the original concept doesn't pan out. I mean, I'm thinking of one of the clear teachings of Darwin was or one of the understandings was he was kind of spurred on by this evolutionary theory by looking at a river chasm and saying, oh, look at how long it must have taken for that river to carve out that chasm. And it turns out that he was wrong about his initial assumption. But when we find out maybe that you're wrong about some of these biological aspects, people don't go back around and say, well, now I got to rethink my economics, or now I got to rethink my social theory. So it is interesting that you have to pull those kinds of things together.
Yeah, I think it's partly because you have the science popularizers, and
Right.
we've always had that. In the era of C.S. Lewis, we had H.G. Wells. Today we've had people like Richard Dawkins, who was a scientist, but he was largely also a scientist popularizer.
Neil deGrasse Tyson.
Neil Tyson, other great example. And these people are pontificating, and that the people who are outside the sciences look at these people and think that they're giving the gospel truth about the current state of science, when in fact they're not. And so I think you have a lot of sort of very naive people outside the natural sciences who think that the natural sciences speak with what you used to call the voice of God, and therefore if they say it, you have to believe it, and not really being willing to ask tough questions. Now, in fairness, this is cultivated by some of the self-identified spokespeople for science who basically say, well, if you're not a scientist, you have no ground to ask us questions. If you're a philosopher or a theologian, let alone a lowly politician, how dare you ask questions? And so, some of the scientific community certainly helps push that line. But I do think, so you basically have a lot of the rest of the culture lagging behind what even the sciences now is even showing. That they're basically still basing their stuff on old 19th century materialist natural science, when the sciences are actually going in a different direction.
Right, exactly. And again, what's funny about that is even the scientists will point to, say, a judge if he's making the decision in the Dover case or something like that. So does it work for me or not? Whereas a judge, who rules what science is? Why would a judge do that? I don't know. We had Stephen Meyer on, actually, and we had a nice 3-hour philosophical discussion, and kind of really geeked out about that. But that's the folks who want to watch the Stephen Meyer episode could go back and look in the archives for that. Anyway, today, though, I want to talk to you about your new book, which is something really, really interesting. It's entitled Stockholm Syndrome Christianity, Why Christian Leaders Are Failing and What We Can Do About It. Now, this is a kind of a provocative title, Christian Leaders Are Failing. And in the book, you make the point that, sometimes maybe you need to soft pedal this kind of stuff, but today is not that time. We are at a time of action. So what spurred you to write this book? What was the thing that you saw that started saying, hey, Christian leaders are starting to go astray and there needs to be a corrective?
Yeah, thanks for asking. Well, it grew over several years, and it came from sort of this question is, the more I interacted, so I was a tenured professor at a historically evangelical Christian university. Through my work at Discovery, I've dealt with people at all levels. In my own sort of personal faith journey, I've been ordained as an elder in 2 different Presbyterian denominations. So I've sort of interacted with lots of people, including lots of Christian leaders. And it just began to dawn on me that a lot of the problems that Christians like to complain about, that they say, oh, it's the atheists or the agnostics or all these people who are ruining our society. And I don't discount that. Yeah, there are bad actors there. There are people who are dragging us down in various ways. But in each of these areas, I began to see, well, there were actually self-identified Christian leaders who, in many cases, were facilitating it. They weren't just ignoring it, they were actually going along, they were actually encouraging it. And then so it began to dawn on me that I think the church, before casting aspersions on everyone else in culture, needs to sort of get its own act together. And if we are, how do I also put it? I saw sort of a naivete among many Christians that, well, if we just convert more Christians and then they enter places of power in the media or the government, then we're going to have a good society. Well, but the fact of the matter is there aren't many self-identified atheists at the top of most professions. Now there are some exceptions, but certainly in politics that's not the case. So the problem of recruiting Christians to go into places of culture, actually that's not a problem. The problem is that they become indistinguishable from the secular materialists when they're in that position. And right. So again, so that was sort of growing on me. One, I had already started working on the book, but one point that really made me want to go on was when my former university, Seattle Pacific, in 2021 or 2022, they had a vote of the faculty where 70% of the faculty, at this, even today, it identifies as an evangelical Christian university, 70+% of the faculty basically voted against the university's statement on biblical marriage. And we're talking about, this is a pretty basic statement that marriage is made for a man and a woman and sex is supposed to be in that context. If you have 70% of your faculty at a Christian university who basically rejects the biblical view of marriage, how can you really have a Christian institution? And my answer to that is, well, you don't anymore. But then how did that come about? This actually got national headlines, both in the Christian and secular press at the time this vote took place. But I saw a lot of people wondering, well, how did this come about? And were so shocked. And having been there, I sort of knew the story. And then I realized I had some things to share for people who are board members, elders, leaders, Sunday school teachers, pastors, that might help equip them. So part of my book is critique, but then equip them with, well, how do you actually effectively challenge this? Where does this stuff actually come from, and how can you, overcome it?
Yeah, you have the book broken down into, I think, 3 main sections, right? So you have the diagnosing the problem area.
The symptoms, yeah. Yep.
The symptoms. And then the second section is kind of how they fall into these kinds of...
Yeah, the root causes, yeah.
And then lastly, it's kind of the cures,
Yep.
how you resolve these things. And to be clear, we're not simply talking Christians. You're specifically talking about those folks who would classify themselves as evangelicals. We're not talking about your standard Anglican or somebody who would come from a more progressive form of Christianity. You're talking about people who themselves see themselves within the evangelical tradition in that regard.
I mostly am talking about that. I do give some examples of Catholics, both those who are traditionalist Catholics, but some who aren't, and I do give some examples from the more progressive wings. But yeah, the heart of this are people who would espouse that they're Bible-believing Christians and largely Protestant evangelical, but aren't, and in their public actions or in their worldview. And so, again, what caused me to think about this was, a lot of people say, oh, well, they're just sellouts or they're fearful. But in my experience with many of these people, they don't consider themselves fearful or spineless or sellouts in their own perspective. And so I was trying to really get inside their mind. What is causing them to do this? And yes, the pressures of the world and the accolades of the world do play into it. But in many of these cases, I think these people genuinely believe that what they're doing is right. And this is what got me talking about sort of the Stockholm syndrome idea, which I know in psychology is quite controversial. I'm not really interested in debating.
There's been a lot of folks who've not been weren't alive in the 1970s, so maybe you can kind of explain the origin of that term.
So Stockholm syndrome goes back to an infamous bank robbery in the 1970s in Stockholm, Sweden, where a couple of bank robbers at gunpoint, I think they had like submachine guns, took several hostages in a bank. But then something strange happened. After it went on for over 100 hours, and by the end of it, these hostages were identifying more with their captors than with the police or anyone else. They actually felt gratitude toward their captors and warm feelings that they were nice people, and so psychologists and doctors and other people tried to understand, well, how could this be? And so a psychologist coined the term Stockholm syndrome. Again, it's quite controversial as a diagnosis in psychology, but I think it does hit on something real, is that sometimes people who are, so to speak, held captive, and sometimes this is also used in abusive situations, can, in a very, sad way, end up identifying with the worldviews of their captors. And I thought, that really explains to me what I've been seeing of Christians who I don't regard in their own minds that they're consciously being sellouts or they're consciously currying favor. They've actually so imbibed some of what I would say, we're held captive culturally by the cultural elites that are largely anti-Christian, unfortunately, now in America. And that if you've gone through, say, graduate school, whether you're a pastor or whether you're someone who's going to go into the media, or then you've gone into a profession like the media or politics where you're surrounded by elites that are very hostile to Orthodox Christianity, one result can be of that is that you end up buying into their diagnosis. And so what you see are Christian leaders who, we're called to be salt and light and basically bring that to the world. But in many of these cases, these Christians have so imbibed this worldview of the secular elites around them that they regard it as their mission almost to try to be missionaries to their fellow believers to make sure they're not so stupid or antiquated or backward. And so they're almost missionaries of the secularist worldview to their fellow believers rather than, the opposite.
Let's look at a couple of specific examples. Yeah. The first one that you bring up is something that a name that's going to be familiar to many, many people, especially after the COVID crisis and the change in administration. You talk about Dr. Francis Collins, and of course I remember Francis Collins when he stepped forth and defined himself as a Christian, and he was actually lauded in the pages of Christianity Today, other places, as being, here's an individual who's doing cutting edge science work at the most high levels of research and in the highest levels of society, and he's a Christian, and isn't that great? And then we start to find out some other things that are happening that gave us pause, not merely with the way he managed the National Institutes of Health response to the COVID crisis, although there's some questions there, but also some of his other research in understanding, what we call chimeran research and things of that nature. So explain that for us a little bit as well.
Yeah, I think Francis Collins is a really good or bad example of what I'm talking about. And so on the one hand, he has a very powerful personal testimony of how he had been atheist agnostic and came to Christ. Great. And then, but many Christians then, they called him a national treasure. They built him up as this Christian celebrity. This shows how you can be a great scientist and also be a personally devout Christian. And this is their mindset, that if you just have people like that who go into public life, well, then we have sort of a Christian influence on the culture. But sadly, that's not the case. And it's also actually an example. Myself and some of my colleagues at Discovery have been raising questions about Francis Collins since the early, mid-2000s, because when he published his book, The Language of God, part of it was his testimony, part of it was his skewering of Christians who didn't embrace unguided Darwinian evolution in a very unfair manner. And part of it, although pro-lifers at the time didn't bother to read it, including the pro-lifers who promoted Francis Collins, in his appendix he made clear that he's not willing to really say that we can know scientifically when human life begins. Well, okay, so the problems with Collins go back a long ways, but he's been there was sort of a conspiracy of silence, if you will, of not to talk about it, and anyone who did raise it would be demonized as being unchristian or unchristlike for, bad-mouthing or criticizing a fellow Christian believer. And so these are one reasons why we get people like Collins. So what am I talking about? So Collins, for more than a decade, was the most powerful scientist in America. He was the head of what's called the National Institutes of Health, which gives hundreds of millions of dollars, tax dollars, for research and sets the agenda for a lot of medical and science research in the United States. And so he was the head of that. And so he was a really powerful figure. And he was this devout evangelical Christian. But if you actually look at how he ran the NIH, and this is pre-COVID, his record is pretty indistinguishable from the most rabid materialist. And what do I mean by that? Well, let's take the issue of abortion. So he oversaw the spending of millions of dollars of our tax dollars to build a nationwide tissue bank at the University of Pittsburgh to harvest body parts from late-term aborted babies, up to 42 weeks in gestation. I mean, that's at term, to do medical research. This is our most devout, poster child or poster boy for evangelical Christianity in the sciences, approved, oversaw the funding, millions of dollars to harvest late-term aborted baby parts for research. And he tried to hide it. I mean, so maybe in his heart he knew something was wrong about it. When a group, Judicial Watch, tried to file a Freedom of Information Act request to get information about what we were funding, the NIH refused. They had to go to court, and the court had to force the NIH to divulge. The only reason we know what I just told you, which is not a conspiracy, it's out there, it's documented, is that a group sued in order to find out. That's not all. So what's some of the research they actually funded with that? Well, one, you mentioned sort of the Chimera experiment. So one was with mice, where they took things like, they took scalps from little babies, aborted babies, and grafted them into these mice for these humanized mouse rodent experiments. And again, more money with your tax dollars that Francis Collins oversaw. But it wasn't just that. So that's abortion, and we could go into that. But, he pledged himself as an ally and advocate, those are his terms, of the LGBTQIA movement, and actually dismissed himself as, even though I'm just a white cisgender male, and cisgender, for those people who know that, is really no Christian should be using that term. That is a put-down term for what you would say would be normal sexuality is. But so he identified himself as that. And what did the NIH fund while he was there in that area? Well, they spent even more millions of dollars on funding some of the most extreme transgender researchers and those who were engaged in cutting off the breasts of young women that were, filling little, kids with puberty blockers. And so millions of your tax dollars under Francis Collins went to that research as well. So again, so it wasn't just that he embraced Darwinian evolution. He embraced these fundings of experiments with aborted baby parts, the harvesting that he pushed, or at least he oversaw and so approved the research that I would say is tantamount to child abuse on young people. And so it's, again, his record. And then when you get to COVID, and I accept Christians have different views on how long the lockdown should have been, or on the vaccines, and I accept that. And I think sincere Christians can have differences of opinions. However, I think there are some lines that I talk about in my book. It's not just Collins; it's with other Christian leaders. So, number one, Collins helped weaponize the biblical command to love thy neighbor, which is a biblical command. And I don't, but he used it as a bludgeon that anyone who disagreed with him on the COVID vaccination, that they were not loving their neighbor. They were being selfish. They were, in fact, in one interview that I cite, he basically says they're responsible for killing thousands of people, including children. I mean, so this wasn't just, so here you had a sincere difference of opinion, conscience-based, some based on abortion, but some also based on efficacy and safety between Christians, and he was demonizing them. And in fact, he supported and advocated mandates that meant that people lost their jobs, fellow Christians lost their jobs. So I would indict him with regard to COVID, and there are a lot of other things not relating to Christianity that I think you could question about what he did during COVID, but the weaponizing of love thy neighbor and the championing of mandates to where many Christians lost their jobs and lost their livelihoods, I think is really beyond the pale. And we can talk more directly if you want later about the whole COVID thing, because I think that raises some issues on religious liberty and some other things more broadly. But so those are 3 or 4 cases where Collins, and the point is he was indistinguishable from the secular materialist. Now, does this mean that he wasn't really a Christian? I don't know the state of his heart. I accept that he personally is devout. But the point is that your personal devotion, it doesn't immunize you from your public actions. He's a public figure. And his worldview for his public policy actions when it comes to life issues, when it comes to sex issues, when it comes to religious liberty issues, was indistinguishable from the most materialist secularists. And that's a problem when you're the most identified evangelical Christian scientist, the most powerful scientist in America, who's a Christian. Basically, his worldview from his public policy is indistinguishable. That's a Stockholm Syndrome Christian.
Okay, yeah. So Collins obviously pulled the company line, I would say, something to that effect. He marched in lockstep with the peers who were not Christians that he would see, and maybe he wasn't reflective or something like that. But it's not just Collins that you're talking about in this book. He's just the first character that you open the
well, I focus on him in the chapter on science, but the first big chapter is actually on the Bible. And we should talk about some of the, and I'm sure you have already talked about these in other of your podcasts, but some of the even evangelical megachurch pastors or leading even Christian apologists who may be good on some things, but then are really adopting views that wouldn't have been considered evangelical before. So, because I think all of this flows from, if you don't take the Bible seriously as authoritative, then it flows out into all these other areas.
So yeah, you mentioned pastors, and of course Andy Stanley is another individual that you highlight. Now Andy Stanley is an interesting character, and again we actually did a show on his controversial conference for parents of children who are coming out as either homosexual or transgender, and my primary critique. And I listened to all of them. I'm friends with Alan Schleman, who actually attended the conference, and he and Sean McDowell spent a good time analyzing the conference, taking it apart. And what my point was, and I think I made a point and Christopher Yuan has made a similar point, is Andy Stanley had a feeling or empathy for these people who were having these transgender issues. And he says it's, we have to be loving as Christians. We can't be how cruel can it be to tell someone that they can't express their identity, for example. And my response is, well, if you're a Christian, that's not your identity. Your identity, fundamentals of the Christian understanding of the world is your identity is in Christ now. That's your identity. Your identity isn't being gay or being transgender. Your identity is a follower of Jesus. And now what else you do is secondary to that. And one of the problems I think we find in our culture is I think this is a good symptom of Stockholm Syndrome, Christianity, is we assume, without even knowing it, some of the cultural background, some of the cultural worldview without filtering it. So we assume that the individual and the individual's feelings are something that should be paramount to the individual. And it's not necessarily your feelings that should drive your self-identity. Now, the problem, again, I said with Andy Stanley, was he did this, and his bigger issue is when people called him out, he doubled down on it. And this is when you start to say, wait a minute, what's going on here? And he doubled down. As a matter of fact, I remember the service that he was, because when the conference itself started making the rounds online, he knew that there was going to be a lot of heat. So he had a Sunday service in order to explain these things. But the Sunday service was the only service that they didn't videotape and broadcast live like they do all of their other Sunday services. Again, having something kind of in a cloistered environment. You talked about Collins not allowing the National Institutes of Health research out. And he pulled back on this, although there were parishioners who were very concerned who tape recorded it, and the service got out anyway. 21st century, you just never, everything will be online. If you don't want it online, don't say it. That's usually the standard. But this was the problem with Sandy. Now, what was your diagnosis for Andy Stanley? Because Charles Stanley, his father, is a very well-respected Bible expositor. He was a solid biblical preacher. Andy seems to have drifted away from that. Tell me how Andy is, in your estimation, exhibiting this Stockholm Syndrome Christianity.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the problems with some of the analysis of Andy Stanley is they focus just on sort of his most recent things, which I think you described really well. And they say, where does this come from? Well, but the thing is, if anyone who was following Andy Stanley and the books he was writing several years ago, you would see where it comes from. And so what I spend most of my time in my book, in the first chapter on, is a deep dive into Andy Stanley's book from 2018 called Irresistible, which is really his attack on the authority of the Old Testament. He calls the Old Testament the obsolete testament. He says the Bible as a whole can't be defended in the public square anymore, and so that even in your churches you shouldn't be citing it as an authority. You can say Paul said this or Jesus said this, but you shouldn't be saying the Bible says that even in your church. And he actually at one point even argues that the books, we should reorder our Bibles so that the Old Testament is moved to the back of the bus, so to speak. Now, just to be clear, he's not just talking about what Christians have always believed. Jesus fulfilled the sacrificial system of the Old Testament. Yes, that's true. So we don't sacrifice lambs anymore. Jesus is our lamb. He's not just talking about that. He's just making a wholesale berating of the Old Testament and basically everything from including anti-Semitism against Jews, he blames on Christians believing the Old Testament. Just think about the logic of that. He's blaming persecution of the Jews on their Old Testament. It's that in of itself, I would say, and I'm not going to, he's not anti-Semitic, but I'm just saying that's a very odd thing to say. Yet this book was endorsed, I'm not going to go into the people, but was endorsed by some leading theologically conservative people, famous Christian apologists who, at best, I hope maybe didn't read it. But so that mindset already shows in that book. he's doing as well. He's been persuaded by the culture that the Bible isn't defensible. So he's imbibed, and I think he honestly believes that. I mean, I think he's speaking out of what he believes.
I think it's easy to take the idea that the law no longer applies, and then you start to equivocate. The law is equal to the Old Testament, therefore the Old Testament no longer applies. And we did this in AD 160 with Marcion. Yeah. I mean, this is not a new
no,
issue.
That's true. And my point is, he's not just saying the law. He says the Ten Commandments doesn't apply, although he says, well, there are some similar things in the New Testament. But he devalues the miracles of the Old Testament. I mean, he devalues everything in the Old Testament. Now, why is this? I mean, he'll say, well, personally, he agrees with some of that, although he doesn't defend it. But he says it in his book, and I think he's telling the truth. He doesn't think the Bible, the Old Testament, is defensible anymore. Well, but where does he get that? He's getting that from, I would say, what we would traditionally call theological liberalism and theological progressive. He's buying into that critique. So that's classic Stockholm Syndrome Christianity. But this is like, it's so sad. One of the saddest parts of that book, and it gets into another chapter where I talk about race and ethnicity, which I think is something Christians should be concerned about, and that the Bible has a robust view of equality and human dignity that we should call on. But he tells this story of how a dad came in because his daughter was dating a black man, and he wanted Andy Stanley, I think this was early in his career, to tell him that this was a sin because Moses was condemned by God because he married a black woman. Okay. Which is completely not true. I mean,
that's a big stretch.
In fact, it's the exact opposite. It was Aaron and Miriam, Moses, brother and sister, who were condemned by God for attacking who Moses married. So I mean, it's not true. It's the opposite of the truth. But what was Andy Stanley's point of telling the story? He doesn't actually go in and say what I just said, that this wasn't true, and he certainly didn't tell the dad that. He said, well, I could have argued with him, but I just and that wouldn't have been worthwhile, and so I just explained that he could love his daughter, or he could have these beliefs, and I mean, okay, maybe pastorally that was what should have been done, but this came in part of his book where he was giving this as an example for why we shouldn't defend the Old Testament.
Yeah, and again, that's neither pastorally appropriate nor is it factually accurate.
And here's where it goes down. If you're disowning and being embarrassed by God's word, which I would say Andy Stanley is, at least with regard to the Old Testament, and I think now some of the things on sexuality, he's basically embarrassed by some of the New Testament teachings too. At the end of the day, what do you have left to offer people? You're not offering them God's word or God's interactions with us through history. You're offering only those little tidbits that go align with current culture. And if your culture is sliding down, I actually have a whole chapter on this. It is a sort of slippery slope. If what you think is acceptable is dictated by the secular culture, if the secular culture slides down into the gutter, you're going to be dragged right along with it. And it's so tragic because I document several of these cases of people who start out with, making some of these key concessions, and then, but they still believe Jesus died for their sins. They still believe, okay. But then as the culture got worse, they got worse until in a number of cases, they just threw it over altogether. Because again, if that's where you're getting what's acceptable, you're going to be as bad ultimately as the culture is. And we have a pretty bad culture. So that's not a good place for a Christian to be. But Andy Stanley, one reason why I harp on him a bit is I was a Presbyterian elder. Andy Stanley is Baptist, but he styles himself as a teacher and mentor for Christian leaders. And as a Presbyterian elder in my church, we were assigned things from Andy Stanley to read, to learn from him as this great teacher. And so it's not just his own mega churches, but he has a megaphone with thousands of pastors around the world that he trains. But what is he training them to do? He's training them to turn their backs on God's word, really. And he's doing it in a sarcastic way. This is the other reason why I get sort of, upset about this, is because he's not doing this even in a mild, reasonable way. He's attacking the other people, the more traditional biblical believers, using sarcastic language, attacking people who don't go to mega churches at one point, that people are stinking selfish if they go to a church that just has a couple hundred people. He later did apologize for that. I mean, this guy is not exhibiting the fruit of a wise Christian leader. And yet, I will tell you, one publisher, I won't name the name, but one publisher that was a major conservative Christian publisher, passed on my book specifically because they weren't allowed to criticize Andy Stanley. The staff were interested in it, but a higher up said, we aren't going to allow a book that criticizes Andy Stanley. And actually, they spiked another book by a person much more famous than I am. I'm not famous.
Okay.
So it's the reason why I feel so passionate about getting this out is that there's sort of we're not supposed to talk about this, but then it multiplies. If you don't talk about it and critique it and open it out to open air, nothing will change.
Well, interestingly, if you look at some of the folks who deconstructed their faith, the ex-evangelicals, right, the Rhett and Links of the world, or some of the worship leaders and musicians, people like that who had otherwise been highly visible within Christianity and then somehow became ex-evangelical. The whole deconstruction movement really usually starts with some seeds of doubt, something that doesn't comport to the modern world. And usually the doubt is something that's based on whatever the current fad or whatever the current social understanding, or whether the current scientific, a lot of times some evolution might be a framework. A lot of times it's how you hold up to same-sex marriage, or all kinds of different initial motivators. But usually that's where it starts. And you talk about Frankie Schaeffer in the book as well, where it follows this path where once you start abandoning some of these tenets, then again, as you said, it becomes a slippery slope. It starts to pick up steam. So it can be a very dangerous thing, and I think that's part of the motivation here that you're using to write the book is to say we don't want to see more people bring in something that will sabotage their understanding of faith, because once you start crippling this aspect of faith, then you start crippling all of it, really.
I think that's true. And one thing that gave me a heart for that is the 12 years I spent as a college professor at an institution that ended up being transformed into something else. It was founded in the 1890s as a very evangelical Christian institution and still advertises itself that way, is I saw how it hurt students. I mean, you had students who came in to our institution who were on fire for the Lord. By the time they left, they weren't. And part of it was actually they were being taught in our theology school that, well, the Bible really, it's not only not inerrant, it really, it's a very human document, and it's, riddled with errors, and so you can't really trust it. It's not authoritative. And then they get spit out on the other side of that, and they may be a Christian in some sense, clinging on in a very personal, pietistic way, but even that, how long is that sustained if it's unanchored to truth? If you don't really think that what you're believing is true, it's hard to sustain. And so, for example, while I was there, it got worse after I left, but one of the things that was sort of the new vanguard at the time among some evangelicals was open theism, that God himself doesn't know the future. And I saw students really struggle with that, because it wasn't that they were doing an academic study of some people who were arguing that and those who were critiquing. It was, no, they were only assigned the people who were pushing it. So it was propaganda. I fully understand as a college professor for why you don't want to engage in propaganda. You want to give people and a full view of the debates there, but that wasn't what was happening. And so I had kids coming into me as a political scientist distraught, because they were saying, isn't there some other view than just open theism? Because and so I read up on it and became semi-expert on it so I could help them. But it was so sad what was happening. And then you had these parents who were giving tens of thousands of dollars going into debt, sending them to their kids to a Christian institution, thinking that they were going to get this faith integration, with their worldview, but they were actually getting the opposite, going into debt for the privilege.
Yeah, I think and I had actually a back and forth once with Jonah Goldberg, the columnist, and I told him, I said, you know what? I think schools should teach the Holocaust denial theory. I think that should, because I think that students should be able to hear a theory like that that's so outlandish. It's an easy softball. It's the t-ball version of debate, where you say, well, what about this, and what about this, and what about this, right? You bring up the counter arguments to show how that fails, or even the flat earthers and their arguments. We need to have someone put them up in a class and line them all up, and then say, okay, and now next week we're going to come back and talk about, that sounds really convincing, but let's see what happens next week when we talk about it, and hold it up to scrutiny. Because they've never seen how both sides work. They've never seen how you can reason through an issue and say, wait a minute, yes, it's true that when the first man that you hear, everything sounds right until another one comes and accuses them, right? That's the biblical says. Now, let me ask you this question, because I think it's interesting. This isn't necessarily a new phenomenon. C.S. Lewis in the Screwtape Letters pointed to these kinds of tactics by the enemy. Matter of fact, you go all the way back to, say, even Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan. I mean, this kind of idea of Mr. Worldly Wise Man and all of this drifting into the world's culture, that's not something that only the 21st century has invented. So what makes this an especially important issue today as opposed to maybe in the past? Or is it something different, or do you see it as unique?
Well, I agree. I think this is a challenge for Christians from the very beginning of Christianity, and even, ancient Judaism. It was also a challenge of adapting to the culture surrounding. Yes, and so I think, so I think it rises and falls. I think the issue is this does happen to be one of the things that we are confronting right now. And so we have confronted in the past. I would say, and I give some examples from the book, in the early 70s, many people don't know about the debates that were taking place in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. This was sort of before some of the debates in the Baptist, Southern Baptist Convention, of theological liberalism influencing their seminaries, and there were some real decision points. And so I think there certainly were other examples, but what you saw in the 1970s, people like Francis Schaeffer and many others coming up and actually really articulating that the Council on Biblical Inerrancy, a lot of various things that grew up out of that because of those challenges. And I'd say, largely, really did help put a course correction for many Christians, certainly for many evangelical Christians. But now we're, several decades after that, and I think it's coming up again. And the challenge is I don't see the same level of people of voices coming out saying that we need to clean our own house on these issues. And that's why actually I mentioned with regard to the publisher that didn't want to do anything countering Andy Stanley. This is more broadly speaking. In the 1970s, you had robust arguments by many theologically conservative Christians about what was happening, and that helped to be a course correction. We do have voices today, but a lot of the mainstream, if you will, evangelical establishment that came of age maybe in the 60s and 70s, where they were reform-minded then, I don't want to say become fat and happy, but they become so establishment that they're not willing to raise a ruckus now. And another example, and I may be touching, we haven't discussed this, so I don't know, but one of the leading Christian apologists, Mike Licona, is now putting out views. He's another one that I've sort of been warned about. Don't touch it, it's third rail. And how dare you question him? He did good work. He's at Houston Christian University. He did great work defending the resurrection, but is now championing what he calls flexible inerrancy. Let's be clear. It's old-style theological liberalism. Let me just give one practical example. He says that when the gospel writers say that Jesus said, my God, why have you forsaken me?" which on the cross, which of course is comes from Psalm 22. He says, well, John basically refashioned that to say, "I thirst." Now, that's not a paraphrase, no matter what he says. I mean, that if you had 1,000 people, I'm not a credentialed Bible scholar, but I don't think you need to be to understand that that's not simply a paraphrase. And saying that the gospel writers rewrote things at that level, and he actually compares the Gospels to Hollywood scripts that were inspired by true events, but then that you change the facts, the situations, the things that actually happen, and the words. That's so far from the traditional evangelical or Catholic view of biblical authority. Yet, if you say what I just said, I know people who will. I mean, I had at least one person people who wouldn't endorse my book, who loved it, but wouldn't because that's too. You can't criticize Mike Licona. He's still a big figure in the Evangelical Theological Society. Well, Houston, you've got a problem. I mean, if you have a leading Christian apologist who's basically saying that the words of Jesus really can't be trusted because they aren't anything like the words of Jesus, and that the Gospels are like Hollywood accounts of a Hollywood biopic.
Right. So, and we have, it reminds me of the 1930s, where you had, of course, the documentary hypothesis, and the German higher criticism was in full swing, and G. Gresham Machen comes in the Counter Reformation. So you see it again, interestingly, 40, 50 years later in the 70s, and now we're seeing it again 40, 50 years later on that. One of the things that I think is especially unique about our current situation is, unlike in some ways, people have always been cloistered into their familiar bubbles, but social media and algorithms, things like that, I think make this type of danger, though it's been around in Christendom, as you say, since the beginning, especially dangerous now because there is an additional appearance of unanimity. Right? The algorithm, the social media bubble makes it seem like everybody holds to this view except you, or something to that effect, or everybody's against this view except. So I think the technology sometimes hinders us, which makes this a little bit of a unique aspect, and why we need to be much more, again, critical in all of the ways that we would approach this. Now, I do know Mike. I've known Mike Licona for years, and talked with him, and both personally and professionally. I don't agree with his positions, and I think I could say that to him, and he's okay with me saying that. But that's at least what should happen. Is there should be this debate happening at these levels. There should be. I mean, Mike has gone on and debated Bart Ehrman, and God bless him for that. I think those are important pieces. I think that there needs to be some inter-evangelical debates going on in order to establish just what we're talking about and what the outfall of that may be. Because I think you're right. These are important issues that really need to be uncovered. So that's just kind of my perspective on the whole thing. I don't think that we should shy away from it. I think that's the worst thing that you can do. I will say, or I want to, as we begin to wrap up, not simply leave this as, oh my gosh, here's all the red flags. Let's talk about how we can move past it. What can we do? You have a call to wisdom, a call to action, a call to faithfulness. Why don't you go through kind of what are the cures to Stockholm Syndrome Christianity?
Well, even before that, I'd say that even the chapters on causes actually are also related to cures. So, for example, one of those chapters is, basically, who do we listen to? Where do we get our information from? And so this tees off of what you were saying about social media. And I go through all the different information sources people, listen to, and in the ways that you may not even know it, that it is actually manipulating or changing how your beliefs are. And you already gave one of it, the appearance of unanimity by whom people are quoting, who is being promoted by the algorithms, who is not. And so it tries to give people a handle on, well, how can you immunize yourself on that? The good news about all the information sources is there are now podcasts like yours and many other information outlets that actually, if you're intentional about it, you actually can get better information into the mix. And so I think one of the things that is key, I mean, as I think personally of people that I've known who've gone down the route of what would consider Stockholm Syndrome Christianity is that too often they basically, all they listen to is, whether it be the Atlantic or the New York Times or whomever, and they don't have a broader array of resources. So they have this tunnel vision, and they don't even realize how they're being shaped by that. So I think that by getting control over the information sources you and your family and your kids and your church members are using, and making sure you get some good information sources along that, that is part of the solution. But yes, so in the chapter on wisdom, I basically talk about around 7 things that to help people when they're dealing with some of these things, that would help you notice. For example, one of them is the abuse of manipulation of language, and make sure that you're actually understanding what the terms are meaning and not allowing people to slide over. And this is some of what, the debates over, well, are there gay Christians? Well, what does that mean?
I have to say I really appreciate that. I did an entire session on what I call the language games of the woke, and how they use propaganda techniques, and I actually support that with going back to the texts and things like that, to intentionally equivocate terms in order to use them as either a lever or a bludgeon, and to shift the debate to their own. So the language is so important these days. People don't realize how big a role it actually plays in the common debate.
Yeah. But with regard to, because I know we have limited time, the chapter on call to action does have 21 things you can do, whether you're a parent, a grandparent, a pastor, a board member, a teacher. And so one principle is do no harm, which is, this may seem really basic, but again, the number of Christians, even if you don't feel you can do something important, how are you spending your time, talent, and treasure? For example, I've known people who have stayed in churches where the pastor has, say, embraced gay marriage. It was a more historically, theologically conservative church, but they've stayed there even though they don't agree because, well, it's too hard to leave because our home group is here, or this is that. But then in many ways, you're worse than the pastor, because presumably the pastor is saying what they think is true. You know it's not, and then you're facilitating it. So number one thing is to make sure that you're not actively enabling things that you know to be wrong. And I think if Christians were more concerned about this, for example, say, where do you give money? Maybe you graduated from a Christian university 30 years ago that was a really fine Christian university, and you now know that it really isn't anymore. But when that donation appeal comes, you write the check because of a warm, fuzzy feeling over. You're enabling the problem. So do no harm. If you're a board member, I go through things that you can do. One is the power of no. Most boards, if you're an elder or a board of trustees or any sort of board, most boards try to govern by consensus. And so that gives a lot of power to even one member to raise an issue to force a discussion. And if you can force a discussion, a lot of these things are happening because no one can discuss them. It's outside the light of day. And so if you can force a discussion, you can often kill that thing. The other thing is, for any Christian institution, I go through some examples, whether it's a church, a Christian school, or a Christian university, or a parachurch group, is the aphorism from politics that personnel are policy. That the number one thing is to make sure that you're hiring people who fit the mission of your institution, and don't slack on that. Often people say, oh, well, we don't want to be, we know we have a statement of faith, or we know we have, the statement of mission, but let's just expand a little bit. Or they don't even ask the questions to the people they're hiring, and then come down the road. Well, the teacher that they're hiring is promoting something that is antithetical to the school. And so paying attention to who you're hiring, and that includes boards paying attention to who their institutions are hiring. So that's why, again, I give 21 things you can do, but those are just a couple examples.
Okay, well, I appreciate that. The book, again, is Stockholm Syndrome Christianity by John G. West. We'll have the links below in our description. And John, I appreciate your time. Thanks so much for coming on. And this is what we hope to do. We hope to be a little bit of salt and light ourselves, and provide a resource so that people can intelligently, thoughtfully and in a balanced way, investigate some of these claims and come out with something that's biblically accurate and holding fidelity to the Christian faith. So, any
Thank
last
you.
comments?
Well, I just think the very last chapter of my book is to give people, if you are really disheartened by what you see, is a reminder that God is sovereign. And I go through examples in history where Christians probably thought that the church was about to be wiped out, and then it turned out there was what I would call a surprise from God, that things went in a different direction. And so ultimately we're called to be faithful, not successful. God will take care of what he regards as success in his own time. And so don't be disheartened. So even if you don't get my book, don't be disheartened. But if you have a heart for this, my book is designed to give you some concrete things you can do, and to remember that God is still is sovereign.
Okay, that's great. I appreciate it. Thank you so much again, John, and I'm sure we'll talk to you sometime soon.
Thank you, Lenny. That was great.
Thank you for watching this Come Reason video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to see more videos like these, consider subscribing to our Come Reason YouTube channel by clicking on the subscribe button. And you can follow us on social media. Lastly, if you'd like to help keep these kinds of videos free, consider providing a donation by clicking on the donation button beside me. Thank you.